All right, we are now live for another live reading from my book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation. This is the first one we're getting to this month and indeed in the new year of 2022. Just trying to get the lighting a little bit better here since this is not just live streaming, but will be out there for a while. That's better. So, um, this is indeed the first we're doing this year. We started doing these live streaming, live readings last year, and they've been, pretty well attended. Some good questions coming out of them. We're sort of picking up in the middle right now. We are looking at the piece by Maurice Blondel and shared by a number of other philosophers who are involved. The Problem of Catholic Philosophy, which is chapter 7 in the work. It's one of the longest pieces. And I would say actually one of the most important ones. It's also one of the most collaborative pieces because Blondel does his presentation at the Société d'études philosophiques, which is, it wasn't the flagship conference, which would be, of course, the based up in Paris, the Société Française de Philosophie, but it was also quite important. And we're going to look today at the letters that were written and then responded to by two other philosophers slash theologians slash historians of philosophy. Actually, both of these people can be called historians of philosophy. And they are Henri Goulier and Joseph Maréchal, the Jesuit. So, let me pick up there at page 202, and we'll look at those letters, the responses. These are kind of, heavy hitters addressing Blondel. There we go. So, comments of Mr. Henri Goulier. The following notes do not bear on the problem Mr. Blondel has raised. They simply have for their goal justifying the possibility of a historical approach. Number one, let us renounce defining philosophy through intellectualism, rationalism, spiritualism, and so on. These ism words designate a state and rigidify an attitude. They are titles to stick on mummies. Intellectualization, rationalization, spiritualization, and such fit better. They evoke an activity. They do not sacrifice the living intelligence and the will to victory that are the soul of all philosophy. Two, philosophy as a kind of work assumes a datum. Prior to the work of the mind, this datum is neither rational nor intellectual, or at least cannot be said to be so. On the other hand, the means by which it is given are not necessarily intellectual or rational or irrational. The qualification of means is also a philosophical work. The person who would be content with everyday thought tied to everyday life, this person would be quite indifferent to the origin of that which is given to them. That is sensations, books, and even books that are said to be inspired. 3, philosophical work is an effort to rationalize this datum, whether reason adds itself there or rediscovers itself there. Does the revealed datum resist this labor? A large part of the sensible escapes reason. Must one say the revealed datum escapes it entirely because it is revealed? Let us take a moral truth. Let us suppose historically admitted that Christ was the first to preach total charity, going as far as love for one's enemies. The content of this teaching is not irrational in any way. Whether a supernatural grace would be necessary to respond in a Christian way to Christ's invitation, that is a question of a different order. It still remains the case that the intellect has received a new and original idea of man, and that it may forget the holy character of the text where that notion is deposited and make it enter into a philosophy. That is a synthesis where faith ought not play any role. In the spirit of medieval philosophy, Mr. Etienne Gilson follows out the philosophical destiny of themes arising within the interior of the Bible and the Gospels. For example, the I who am. In this, there is no necessary naturalization of the Christian contribution. This signifies simply that there can be truths natural and revealed at the same time. Natural by right, in this sense, that human reason can establish them. Revealed in fact, since a revelation is given reason, a dispensation from that work. The question is one too classical for it to be necessary to insist upon it. There are then, it seems, three forms of Christian influence, and by distinguishing them, we will better see the historical approach's legitimacy. One, natural truths appear in an inspired text and then live outside of their context. The idea of creation, it seems, is of this sort. Two, supernatural truths presented as such are powerful stimulants for a philosopher's reason. They allow him to better understand the universe, though he cannot exhaust their content. Malebranche's theory of knowledge supposes the fact of the fall, and in that very philosophy, the fact of incarnation is the ray of light justifying the existence of the world. Three, the philosopher considers Christianity as an experience of the divine formed from 1,000 diverse experiences. He gathers together exemplary Christians and today does not conceive of a metaphysics that would not rest upon their testimony. Such is the method Mr. Bergson proposes in his latest book. And here's a footnote, translator's note. Goulier has in mind in here Bergson's The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. Noting the existence and the varieties of these three influences is a historical task that compromises neither philosophy nor religion. The philosopher and the religious magisterium always remain free to critique this or that formula. We do not see what would allow them to critique the historical method of posing the problem. They can reject this or that philosophy that calls itself Christian. They cannot deny the possibility of a Christian philosophy. That is, of philosophical themes imminent to Christianity and consequently of the historical problem concerning the existence and the destiny of these themes. If we compare such a project to that of Mr. Maurice Blondel, we will see that they are too different to rule each other out. The first will perhaps appear to be the natural introduction to the second. All right, Mr. Blondel's response to Mr. Goulier. Mr. Goulier's so precise outline takes account already of a convergence of views resulting from previous letters I have exchanged with him when he had been led to believe that my position was contrary to the historical point of view and would even risk in the end preparing rationalism's triumph by affirming a heterogeneity between the God of reason and the God of grace. I thank him for having understood that this charge or this suspicion remains without object. He no longer discounts my attempt, and he would like only to show that it does not cross the path he takes, because this is the labor of a historian who at first applies himself to the Christian contribution, and because this labor seems sufficient to provide the expression Christian philosophy, the triple legitimate sense with which, in his view, it is compatible. Granted, he no longer prohibits me from going beyond this, but speaking truly, he does not at all examine how a further movement is possible or legitimate, nor in what manner perhaps a doctrinal examination reacts on the historical perspectives he sticks with, nor how the philosopher can, for the present or for the future, carry out a work of initiative and synthesis in the way of previous speculations. Would we have to believe that because of its erudition, philosophy is no more than history of concepts and critical analysis of the past? Without failing to recognize in any way the irreplaceable services history has rendered and still renders to Christian thought, I maintain that the three phases limiting the horizon that satisfies Goulier do not safeguard the Christian meaning and do not lead to Catholic philosophy unless, in the very course of such movements, the philosophical problem of the supernatural already raises itself at least implicitly, and unless, consequently, this itinerary leads us to more and more explicitly raise the salutary difficulty on which depends the effective encounter and the legitimate symbiosis of a philosophy and a Christianity, each as authentic and integral as the other. I am happy to hear Mr. Goulier turning away from mummies and all that would freeze the activity of the philosophical spirit into immobile and rigidified concepts. All the more reason not to imprison living intelligence in the sepulchre of systems and to not subject to the forms of the past, not only the conquering activity of the present and the future, I say, but what there is of eternal vitality, of metaphysical truth, of religious aspiration in what is then the soul of doctrines, where the historian himself must seek something other than the sediment of concepts. 2. Simply because philosophy would have to draw upon a universal datum or even data, it does not result that it must submit to them like to something that is partially irrational or that becomes rational only by a superadded elaboration, especially when it is a matter of nourishment or goals of the spiritual life. Speculation normally tends to render everything it has to accept intrinsically intelligible and to permit its own initial passivity so as to actively consent and cooperate. What is merely submitted to is never as such integrated philosophically. The Christian fact would not even be a fact for philosophy if it entered into the philosophical organism only as a raw contribution. But it is precisely all this that will structure the crisis in which the unique, original, and irreducible character of a Catholic thought, solicitous of an intellectual submission to its true object, will either be eclipsed or shine forth. 3. Starting from the notion he provides us of the datum submitted to, of which a part remains refractory to rationalization, that is, to an elaboration of concepts, Mr. Goulier definitively sets aside what in the Christian contribution refuses this conceptual work. From that point on, by the very examples he offers, he confines Christian speculation insofar as, according to him, it accepts a philosophical value to what can be extracted from the revealed datum by and for the use of reason. An extraction that, he has just pointed out to us, accepts different modalities, but that ends up in every case in naturalized truths. Sometimes these are theses that had not been able to be or would not have been able to be discovered by reflection without revelation. Sometimes these are new precisions and confirmations from which philosophical truths that are acceptable but still mixed up with errors or uncertainties benefit. Sometimes these are the discoveries of the consciousness that has lived out some religious experience and sees it arise in itself ideas, aspirations that seem spontaneously human, although these products of civilization would not have been able to appear without Christianity having been introduced to the world. But under all these aspects, which are real and which we can in fact call Christian, the problem evaporates. The specificity of the Spirit of Christ has disappeared. One takes advantage of his gifts, but by bringing them back to the rational plane and by peeling off the stamp of their origin, of their authenticity, of their demands. Everything essentially transcendent to the naturally human order is immanentized. This is to strip oneself of every means of reserving a place for the supernatural properly called. One might as well say that from such a point of view, philosophy that is judged to be Christian by the censor is an a-Christian doctrine that secularizes the mystery of Christ with this double danger, either hoarding up for modern reason little by little all that faith claimed to contribute, or relegating the definitively extra philosophical element to impenetrable obscurity without even being able, as philosophers or as historians, to set any justification forth for the use of the term supernatural, while continuing to use the term in order to escape either from pure rationalism or from a mysticism foreign to any metaphysical and historical grounding. Such criticisms are not at all aimed at the use of history. They aim only at the three theses according to which either the problem would be initially set only by the contingent data of an external order, or the rational elaboration of these facts would constitute the unique and sufficient task of Christian thought, or the religious experience of the gospel story would disengage the ideas included philosophically in Christ's message and would succeed in discerning and preserving the specifically rational character of Christianity. What is essentially up for question is not partial coincidence of reason and faith, but the possibility and the obligation to open philosophy to an order incommensurable with it. So far as we have not seen or resolved this difficulty, historical or doctrinal compatibilities remain ambiguous or make us liable to fall into an immanentist naturalism without us touching or even suspecting the wounded point of consciousness, a salutary wound by which alone the divine graft can be inserted into our thought, the graft that must contribute its sap in order for there to be new fructification. In a more concrete manner, we could respond to the objection by saying that the problem is that of distinguishing and of reconnecting the God of the metaphysicians and the crucified of Calvary, the intelligible in its necessary demands, and the order of grace and charity that doubtless is not at all contrary or foreign, but that remains superior to the requests of reason itself while it responds to a congenital desire and secret stimulations. Christian philosophy's task consists in proscribing the two abuses of confusing or opposing nature and supernature, history and doctrine, and in preparing their inviolable distinctions as well as their legitimate alliance. All right. Comments of Mr. Joseph Maréchal, S.J. In the recent debate about the possibility of a Catholic philosophy, it seems to me that Mr. Blondel has untangled the true knot of the problem, a problem before everything else, a doctrinal one, one that cannot be treated by history's methods alone, a problem already set out in Axion 1893, if it is true, as Victor Del Boll wrote, that this deep and always current book's original thought was to establish a philosophy that was religious not by accident, but by nature, without, however, being so by prejudice. A problem in principle resolved from that time on, the same solution is represented to us now, but enriched by new precisions. No doubt that, speaking in an unqualified sense, it would be acceptable. It offers nothing that philosophers must reject in advance in the name of reason's autonomy, and nothing either, I think, at which the most demanding theologians can reasonably take umbrage. As to the very ground of the question, even if it is not exempt from difficulty, Mr. Blondel's thesis seems to me the only possible solution of a problem that is perhaps not a supplementary or accidental one. Just 2 or 3 remarks on this subject. Number 1, I admit at the start feeling some repugnance at reuniting under the same title Catholic philosophy or Christian philosophy or religious philosophy, either philosophy given over to its own means but constrained by the very consciousness of its natural insufficiency to reserve the place for a hypothetical supernatural order, or supernaturally illuminated philosophy undertaking again under the light of faith the exploration of its own proper domain. Of these 2 possible states of philosophy, the second, by virtue of its alliance with revealed faith, certainly appears formally Catholic, as scholastic philosophy is still, to the degree, at least, that in conformity with dogma, it revises and purifies many accepted notions of metaphysics, substance, person, accident, etc., as will the enlarged philosophy whose vast horizons Mr. Blondel has us take in. But the first of these 2 states, the rational foundation of the second, reveals that only the free adherents of faith would cross. Remains nevertheless separated from it by an incommensurable distance that only the free adherents of faith would cross. It represents the endpoint of philosophy, plain and simple, when it goes to the extreme of its natural powers. There's nothing intrinsically or univocally Catholic about it. Does it marify this qualifier that we give it here? Just as much as Mr. Blondel, but with less resignation, perhaps, I sense the imperfection of a too elliptical terminology. 2, in relation to revealed theology, philosophy as such is incontestably autonomous in the sense that it does not borrow principles or primary data or a method of demonstration from it, and that therefore, if it recognizes its own limits, it must find in itself the means for defining them. Also, speaking precisely, autonomous philosophy does not necessarily mean rationalist philosophy, nor even separated philosophy. The illusion of a separated philosophy capable of buttoning itself up on its own plane without opening problems that exceed it still haunts many minds, even among Catholic theologians. Looking at it closely, however, these latter impose on philosophy requests to which a really separated philosophy cannot do justice. I believe, on my part, that a separated philosophy leads logically either to this methodological rationalism that, in speculative textual, historical, and scientific critique, imposes on itself a rule of refusing the hypothesis of the supernatural as unintelligible and unassimilable to the, or to that dogmatic rationalism whose mature form in metaphysics is always pantheism, the destroyer of the supernatural. We escape these consequences. But will this not be to fall from Carbitus into Scylla? If philosophy, as Mr. Blondel rightly affirms, can retain its necessary autonomy without erecting itself into separated philosophy. We then assume that human reason could know itself radically incapable, according to the absolute ideal at the ground of all reason, of bringing to perfection the system of truths it would have legitimately built up to a certain level. Expressed in another way, we suppose that reason becomes conscious of its own natural limits in the very consciousness of an uncoercible but inefficacious aspiration to exceed them. Here, then, the problem of the supernatural formulated in reason's terms arises. Why do so many theologians remain mistrustful before this perspective that should put them at ease? Let it be permitted to me to extract, if I dare call it such, the dialectical quintessence of their objections. For they signal, perhaps, in Mr. Blondel's demonstration, the precise point at which he rejoins the thought of certain classical and modern Thomists, a formulation it would be useful to reinforce. Reason's deep aspiration for exceeding its natural possibilities is called, in scholastic language, the natural desire for perfect and supernatural beatitude, this consisting in the immediate intellectual possession of God. Let us suppose resolve the preliminary question raised by certain people, that of the theological acceptability of a natural desire of the supernatural. We must understand that this desire, inefficacious in itself and objectively conditioned by the eventuality of an entirely free and gratuitous divine gift, does not at all possess the character of a strict demand and allows only the pure possibility, not the existence, of a supernatural destiny to be logically concluded. But this point established, a fundamental objection remains. A natural desire for the supernatural, they say, is not something apparent and cannot be demonstrated either. It is not apparent. A primitive inclination latent under the operations of the soul, it is only indirectly discernible by means of these operations. It must be demonstrated. The scholastics attempted this demonstration, and St. Thomas himself in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, see particularly Chapter 5, makes it rest in the last analysis on the law of complete universality ruling our rational activities and thus measuring the fundamental dynamism. Quote, to the absolute unlimitedness of the formal object of our intelligence, an unlimitedness that is the condition of thought's logical properties, corresponds, they say, the unlimited scope of a natural desire, embracing in a confused wish for immediate intellectual possession, the entire amplitude of being and consequently also infinite being. But the immediate possession of infinite being is the supernatural end itself. This reasoning, some object, errs at least in one point. The natural desire of the intellect bears on all being, all the possible, but not at all on the impossible in itself, non-being. To conclude with certainty that this desire confusedly embraces the immediate possession of God, one would have to know as a preliminary that this is not something impossible in itself. And how can one know that except by the very faith in a religious revelation? In this case, I confess the friends of the Blondelian thesis seem to me to have a lot of work to do. Would St. Thomas, they follow up, have committed such an evident mistake of logic? Let that not stand. A great number of Thomists down through the centuries see in the Summa Contra Gentiles argumentation not the proof of the possibility of the supernatural by the means of natural desire of the vision of God, but only the proof that under the implicitly admitted hypothesis of a supernatural order of salvation, the deep desire of the intellect does not have a saturating endpoint prior or inferior to the vision of God. Despite the ingeniousness with which this interpretation has been many times defended, the text of the Summa Contra Gentiles, it seems to me, resists here and in everything essential, renders correct the Reverend Father de Broglie's exegesis, by which Mr. Blondel authorizes himself. But I cannot linger here over that debate. What has to be conceded to the objection is that St. Thomas's demonstration, if it must remain free of all theological presupposition, depends on two general principles, of which the second, under its abstract form, perhaps does not possess the same degree of evidence as the first. For number one, every faculty tries to equal by its operations the extensive fullness of its formal object. Every faculty aims vis-a-vis what sort of object? At the perfect mode of its operation. But the perfect operation of the intellect is direct, or even intuitive apprehension of its object. Secundum eorum substantiam, says St. Thomas. Let an object be indirectly signified to our intellect, for example, the creator and creatures, and the intellect will necessarily desire, by necessity of nature, to know it in itself directly. It is here that an objection will draw up short. By necessity of nature, how can we know that? So long as a doubt still remains about the intrinsic possibility of the claim to be desired knowledge. The perfect mode, the object of the natural desire, is only the most perfect mode that the constitution of the faculty and the constitution of the object tolerate. Nevertheless, I believe that St. Thomas in the Summa Contra Gentiles not only wanted to produce a strictly rational proof, but also correctly constructed it. The critical remarks I have just related deform it somewhat by reducing it entirely to the type of formal analytical deduction, proceeding by a simple partitioning of concepts under the light of abstract principles. Perhaps, under this aspect, St. Thomas's proof is not peremptory. It regains its advantage, understood before everything else, as a concrete exploration of the life of the mind, a true interior experiment where a primitive functional necessity expresses itself in exercise, directing every intellectual act, whatever its content may be. And in fact, understood in this way, the Summa Contra Gentiles text allows it. It would be most in harmony with the dialectic, rational and concrete at the same time, animating a similar proof in the book Action 1893. Still, if one will permit me one last aporia, deprived of practical interest, I admit, should we not then address to St. Thomas himself the question set recently to Mr. Blondel? A concrete dialectic that discovers in us the confused natural desire for something beyond nature, does this explore an essential disposition of the human intellect, or rather some disposition created in the intellect by the contingent fact of humanity's primitive vocation to supernatural life? In the first case, this dialectic really grounds a philosophy in the ordinary sense of the word. In the second case, no, because it presupposes a supernatural fact. To know which of these cases we are in, reason does not possess any decisive criteria other than the following. The latent desire for divine intuition, is it or is it not the necessary intrinsic condition of all our intellectual activity, so that to deny it brings us back to denying the intellect itself by suppressing the root of the possibility of knowing and willing? In the affirmative answer, we have not left the field of philosophy, but this regressive proof of natural desire, a sort of transcendental deduction demanded by a pointed critique, is provided to us, I believe, among other riches, in the pages of Action 1893, but not explicitly in the Summa Contra Gentiles. By supplying it, Mr. Blondel responds in advance to the difficulty that he himself recounted in his presentation. For if the primitive dynamic orientation of natural reason already designates as the hypothetical endpoint of an inefficacious desire the very endpoint towards which the supernatural activity rooted in this dynamism strives, no ambiguity remains as to the identity of the absolute summit, an asymptote for reason, the true end for faith. But of course, we would have to make this solution in principle valid in the details. Mr. Blondel's response to Mr. Joseph Maréchal, S.J. The Reverend Father Maréchal, professor of the School of Philosophical Sciences of Louvain, of a competence and penetration universally admired in the field of speculative theology, brings to us a contribution of exceptional value for which we are deeply grateful. Adhering to the majority of his analyses and his conclusions, which I would like to comment on at length, I must, to my regret, confine myself here to several brief reflections. 1. The Reverend Father entirely rightly signals the multivocity of the expression Christian or Catholic philosophy. In the third part of the Cahier 20 of the Nouvelle Journée, I had spontaneously indicated the three stages where philosophy can provisionally halt, but to which it must ultimately climb. Philosophy that begins by being a complete and comprehensive metaphysics relative to necessary virtualities of any created mind, with its congenital aspirations and its limitations, which do not hinder the infinite perspectives of thought and willing. Philosophy that then continues by a study of positive deficiencies, of dispositions that result from them, of real obligations deriving from the historical or concrete state in which man has been constituted, has fallen, is called again. Philosophy, finally, that must take account of all those auxilia externa et interna, whether they be subconscious or unnamed, without, for those reasons, ceasing to possess a psychological and dynamic reality. But the name befitting each of these stages is not equally Christian, and I have noted that if one uses it even for the first, it is because the light of Christianity alone has actually allowed the rectilinear and unrestricted attitude of rational doctrine, compatible with all the requirements and nothing but the requirements of faith, to be rendered exact. The litigious qualifier is all the more justified for the higher stages, since they concern not only rational necessities and metaphysical foundations of faith, but also realities that gratuitous gifts and the divine vocation incarnate. Even if I have preferred the singular designation Catholic philosophy, it was in order to cause to reemerge at the same time the universalist character and the purity of the properly supernatural element that this endpoint implies, and that if we reflect on this in a fundamental way, alone renders conceivable and viable the both rational and religious doctrine whose proper designation we are seeking. 2. The Reverend Father Maréchal offers us a model of erudite and steel-sharp discussion, illuminating by its dialectical precision and comprehensive in its goodwill. Since he has so generously shed light on my intentions and the very goal of my work, I will not follow his track step by step, where I would have only to proceed along the path I myself took. I will confine myself, therefore, to 2 or 3 complementary glosses. Even if we place ourselves at the start, or if we try to remain within the domain of abstract analyses of the nature of faculties and the perfection of their exercise in light of their object, it seems to me we must remove certain inconsistent and even mutilating objections. Yes or no? Does reason know and even demonstrate normally and with certainty that God is? Yes or no? Do we legitimately and with a rational necessity affirm that God is one, infinite, the principle of intelligibility and reality, the supreme end, and that at the same time he incommensurably exceeds our knowledge and range of our grasps? Yes or no? Knowing that God is truth, goodness, beatitude, can we not attempt to glimpse more of him, to desire something of his beauty and his felicity, while still realizing his secret belongs to him, that its possession does not depend on us, that reasonably we cannot claim to attain it and conquer it without our ceasing to experience a spontaneous nostalgia that the most generous labor of reflection of science of human virtue only makes wax stronger, become more exact and exalted. If this is so, how can we not affirm that such an aspiration and such a nostalgia are not congenital and constitutive in every spiritual creature? How can we not recognize that no intellectual and moral consciousness is possible and real, even in subordinate applications, without this intimate and supreme spring? Will we say that philosophy can confine itself to what has been called the God of the philosophers, close itself up in a concept and fix an immobile doctrine that would be philosophy itself, perfect and sufficient, without restlessness and without religious expectation? But would we have thus to divide God into 2 slices? One that reason could grasp and devour, and then one that would be super metaphysical in its mystery, juxtaposed to the zone of absolute clarity? There seems to me something unintelligible in the hypothesis of this slicing up that the unbridgeable separation of natural theology and the God of tradition, and one must say the God of conscience, entails. And the very idea of a philosophy in itself, does it not contradict the etymology, the reality, the life of this word, and of this so human thing that results from all of our being penetrated by the sursum of reason towards infinity? Thus, even from the abstract and conceptual point of view, there is in fact a necessary and metaphysical question that imposes itself on the most developed philosophy, according to Cardinal Deschamps' expression, and to take advantage of a suggestion of the Reverend Father Maréchal that offers a sort of alternative, I add that far from opting between two endpoints, we must hold two solutions at the same time. On the one hand, from the ground of intelligible nature arises the uncoercible and inefficacious movement that expresses itself by indeterminate desire of vision and beatitude. And this already derives essentially from philosophical speculation. On the other hand, in humanity's concrete and historical state, the positive calling and the interior or exterior stimulations rendering it obligatory, decisive, and accessible are added to this order of necessary possibility. Philosophy, which does not terminate in concepts, but which bases itself on realities of nature, of human experience and history, also can and must take account of this concept in the integration of the doctrine that rightly claims to neglect none of the data of the problem to resolve. But in order to productively take account of all the concrete data without confusion and without presumption, it would be necessary for philosophical science as a preliminary to go through the critical and metaphysical phase that alone prevents any hybridization of natural powers and supernatural gifts whose differentiation, compatibility, and cooperation Catholic philosophy must secure. By thus reconnecting the two paths that the Reverend Father Maréchal has shown us to be legitimate and complementary, I hope to enter into his views by adding that these paths are solidary and subordinate. Against those who limit Christian speculation to the historicity of the factual data, or against those who no longer partisans of a sort of historicism, but of what might call a historism, would like to seek in the profound history of souls the human elements of a religious synthesis, I give him infinite thanks for having indicated that the problem to raise necessarily implies a metaphysical aspect and a determination of the notion of the supernatural at the intersection of rational demands, historical data, and intimate experiences. None of these elements sufficing by itself, speculatively or practically. So that takes us up to the discussion that will then happen between Maurice Blondel, Jacques Paillard, and Gaston Berger, which we will read and talk about next time. And then we're getting to part 3 of the book. So everybody's weighing in at the start, saying hello. So hello to everybody. So Masak is he. So I'm not sure which he you're referring to because we've got 3 different people here, claiming that all metaphysical revelation of God and that is similar to the concept of multiplicity of Bergson. Absolutely not. Those have zero connection at all. Multiplicity in Bergson, I mean, if you look at the essay on the immediate givens of consciousness, translated as time and free will, multiplicity just means multiplicity, right? And it doesn't have any religious connotations at all. It has metaphysical connotations. One of the points Bergson is making from the very beginning is that time understood as sort of linear cut up time, and language understood in certain ways, and spatiality is not adequate to our experience, which is indeed of multiplicity. But these have no connections to each other whatsoever. And I would suggest, if you want to understand these thinkers, stick with the people that they're actually talking about. So, Thomas was referenced in this. It can't hurt to look at the Summa Contra Gentiles that's being discussed there. Bergson, as I mentioned much, much earlier when I was doing the introduction, did not take part in these debates. He had a follower, Edward Leroy, who played an incredibly marginal part in the very first part of the debates, but the Bergsonians were not really involved. And when you read the work that's actually mentioned, it's kind of hit or miss. The two sources of morality and religion could have been an entry into these debates, and it wasn't. Bergson wasn't really attuned to these things. Another one from Mossack is he claiming that all metaphysical relation of God are valid. Nobody's ever claimed that all metaphysical revelations claimed as revelations of God are valid. So that's kind of a non-starter. You're not going to find that among any philosophers of religion, and you're not going to find that among religious practitioners. That's why some people say, well, your visions are bullshit. Our visions are good. So that one's kind of a non-starter way to approach this stuff. What I will say is that when it comes to thinking about revelations, these people are extraordinarily careful with it. They're not like, well, God said to me in a dream last night, blah, 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 blah. So therefore I need to incorporate that into philosophy. They're like, well, how do you know it was God in the first place? And let's think about the meaning of what's actually being said here. And let's bring some tools to bear on it. We don't want to be prejudiced against it and say, well, there can't be any revelation, be like a Humean about miracles or something like that. But one thing that is, running throughout these debates is an incredible sophisticated attitude towards these sorts of ideas coming in and being willing to say, listen, revealed truths, they have to be integrated. They can't just be plunked down and be the deciding factor. So that would be where you actually, you want to go back and get your hands on a copy of the text and read what Gilson wrote and read what Blondel wrote and read what some of the other thinkers that we've read up to this time have said. So Mark says, could you perhaps speak a bit more about the relationship between theoria and the beatific vision? So, they're referencing a discussion that actually took place in the earlier part of the 20th century before these 1930s debates. You hear them mentioning the term Guy de Broglie, right? So Guy de Broglie was a Christian author, very interested in unpacking this natural desire for the supernatural, which we do find Thomas referencing. And because Thomas referenced it, and because so many philosophers were, at least in theory, Thomists, you kind of couldn't get away from it, right? And this is a great thing to respond to people who want to say you've got a natural order and a supernatural order, and they're sort of like oil and water. One is on top of the other. They don't mix. Whether they're rationalists who are like, this supernatural order is all imaginary bullshit, or whether they're the neo-scholastics who are like, these got to be really, rigidly distinguished philosophies down here, theologies up here, or the fideists who are like, the philosophy part, that's all crap, get rid of it, right? These are the basic categories that Etienne Gilson laid out in his contribution, again, very early in this work. If there is something like a natural desire for the supernatural that is inarticulate, but which we cannot really escape from. And it's not just a metaphysical thing like the need for being or something like that. And it's not a purely psychological thing like the need to belong to groups, but something that really does tap into the transcendent and something that can be refined. Then that can be sort of like what Husserl in his time called a Leitfaden, a leading clue, something that orients our inquiry. And this fits in very well with Blondel's own view that one thing that would be necessary in order to have a genuinely Christian philosophy is that it be what we call a philosophy of insufficiency, that can figure out where philosophy itself does not meet up to its own desires, its own norms, and where there are, he had different names for this, empty spaces, voids, lacunae within it that are yet to be filled. And they can only be filled if they're actually recognized as being there, if they're not paved over and hidden. So I don't know if that's fully answering the issue, but let me take up these others from Massacre. Is Maréchal's concept of an agnostic philosophical foundation similar to Heidegger's option that philosophy should be atheistic and God will later fit into the picture? I don't think so. Again, I wouldn't try to bring in other people to do comparison and contrast here. I think that's going to be misleading you. and probably not very helpful at all. You want to take these people on in their own um, on their own view. I mean, we could talk about Heidegger here. Heidegger's conception of philosophy is found in phenomenological interpretations of Aristotle. Heidegger's conception of philosophy is found in many works of Heidegger. And I would not rest very much just on one single work like that. That strikes me as a recipe for going wrong and understanding Heidegger. But Heidegger is not really relevant here. You know, and Maréchal is not saying that we have to have a completely agnostic philosophical foundation. He's saying there's a lot of moving parts to this, right? So one of the things that I particularly like with these two, Henri Goulier is a very, very important French historian of philosophy who was attuned to these debates. And, like he mentions, he had some correspondence with Blondel about them. He was one of these figures who could recognize that some of the key positions in the debates, like that of Gilson and Maritain on one side, and that of Maurice Blondel on another, and Gabriel Marcel and some of the other people involved, were actually compatible and complemented each other. Something that Blondel and Gilson and Maritain were unwilling to recognize. They were a little bit too polemical towards each other. So Goulier is really good on that. Maréchal, I'll mention too, by the way, brilliant thinker. Never got to teach graduate students. I'm not sure what it was about the Jesuits where they decided to kind of screw him around that way, but he wrote a lot of really great historical studies of philosophy for the young, seminarians that he was teaching. It's kind of a sad story in some ways. All right, Mark, to expand on my question, it seems that Aristotle's concept of theoria presents something like the fulfills but limited to reason, longs for the divine but never actually reaches it, while in a Christian concept, the beatific vision fulfills but transcends reason and offers a more satisfactory possibility. Yeah, I would say it's not that simple. I would say Aristotle's concept of theoria already includes a certain kind of the divine, because what do we contemplate? Well, the things that don't really change, like the heavens. And I mean, we can actually also have theoria of human affairs, like, well, what is the politics? That's also theoria, or uh, um, using the mind in that particular modality that's not directly practical, despite Aristotle saying, oh, we're studying this to be practical. Bullshit. There's also, it's clear that Aristotle's interested in this stuff for the sake of knowing it. And, he doesn't talk that much about the divine in most of the books that we tend to read, but, there are discussions enough where there's speculation about just how many divine objects are there in Aristotle. So Aristotle does have a conception of the divine. Here's where we get to something interesting. So there are multiple conceptions of the divine. And one of the very things that Christianity, I would say, puts on the table, and doesn't do so just by saying, boom, there's revelation, man, go to work on it, but rather in a sort of cumulative dialectical process, is the nature of the divine. And a lot of that is building off of stuff that's there in the Jewish scriptures and traditions, but also there, as Clement of Alexandria recognized, in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, and in other things as well. So the beatific vision is just one thing that transcends reason. If you look at Anselm of Canterbury, he's not asking for the beatific vision. He's asking for understanding, right? Fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. And that is going to be an understanding that is sort of like, to use Blondel's wonderful metaphor of the graft, there's a wound, a cut, an opening, and the divine comes in and grafts itself in there. And there's a mixture where it's no longer so easy to say, here's where the divine ends and here's where the purely human begins. Daniel, what was the influence of this debate on the Vatican Council? There was no influence of this debate on the Vatican Council. There was influence of some of the thinkers involved in the debate on the Second Vatican Council. For example, Maurice Blondel is often called the philosopher of Vatican II, right? And why is he called so? Because through people like Maréchal, transcendental Thomists, he influenced the debate, their influence on people like Karl Rahner, and his massive influence, along with others like Charles Péguy and other people, on the Nouvelle Théologie, two different strands that flowed into the Second Vatican Council. But there's no direct line between this debate and the Second Vatican Council. It's much more like the same people have some involvements in it. This is an interesting way of talking about things. Aquinas seems to plug something of a gap in Aristotle. So that's a pretty Blondelian way of looking at it. Rather than Aristotle understood the complete natural order. This is the bullshit scholastic way of looking at things, or the crappy history of philosophy way of looking at things. So we had Aristotle, and he was like the brilliant, the philosopher, and understood the natural order. And then, we had Aquinas, who came in around, the 13th century and managed to, take Aristotle's ideas and the Christian Bible and bring them. And all you got to do is read a couple pages of Aquinas, and you realize that that's totally not how things work. Aquinas was somebody who read voraciously across a whole bunch of different philosophical and Christian traditions, and who tries to synthesize and incorporate in a dialectical manner all of these things. And there's places where, there's gaps in Aristotle, even from the perspective of the non-Christian Aristotelian commentators in antiquity, where they're like, wish Aristotle would have said more about this, so that's why I'm going to say more about this, right? I think about Alexander of Aphrodisias, who is, if Aristotle is the philosopher, Alexander is called the commenter, right? Blondel said this is going to be the case. This is naturally the case for philosophy. Every philosophy is full of holes, empty spaces, lacunae. This is a natural part of philosophical work. There's holes in Thomas Aquinas's own views. And that's, who knows what he saw in his vision towards the end of his life, when he gave up writing the Summa Theologia and quit the commentary on the Psalms at number 54, which is unfinished, a Psalm commentary that I've translated. But part of it could have been a realization of the inadequacy, the insufficiency of the philosophy that he had generated. All right. Abdur Rashid, greetings from Somalia. You like the videos? That's very nice to read. And I will keep doing that. Mark says, I want to say I can't attest to the original French, but to my ear, your translations are a pleasure to listen to. You've conveyed these debates with a lot of life. Thank you. Yeah, and it's kind of funny. So this is the product of a past Greg, a Greg from 20 to 10 years ago. A Greg who was in his 30s and published this when he was 40, not even 41. I'm now 50, and when I read it, I am, except when I see a typo or something like that, I'm pretty happy with the renditions as well. Now, a lot of that is to the credit of the writers themselves. And some of them are a pleasure to read in the French. Some of them are less of a pleasure for their style until you get used to it. Blondel is one of those guys. Man, he can be tough to read, like Hegel or like Cicero. Cicero in the original, not so much Cicero in English. And, some of them, like Etienne Gilson, are just great writers. Brehier was too. Sertiange, I would say, is. And so I think that's part of what comes through. Some of them, there's not much you can do to fix it. Like Jean Devolvé's French, you're like, what in the hell is this? You know, what's this guy saying? So you just try to make it work. So a lot of it's due to the source material. It's sort of like being a musician who plays other people's music. If the music they wrote is good, okay, you're going to sound pretty good. If what they wrote is just kind of trite and boring, well, you're gonna be kind of boring. Um, Zeno, currently reading a textbook from my ethics class. It's talking about consequentialism in the beginning. Yeah, okay, that's great. I don't know that has anything to do with this, but that's pretty common. Devani, the relationship between reason and revelation seems so vital for our understanding of the world. What could be done? A good question. What could be done to make this more central to our humanities education today? Wow, that's a great question. So I'll just say two things. One is it would actually have to be like thematically introduced by people who know what they're talking about and aren't just taking easy solutions or stuff like that. And that's a tough sell. We don't even have philosophy classes in our K through 12 education unless you go to a religious school, in which case it might be not very good philosophy or it might be decent philosophy, taught usually as a religion not objective, an elective. Or if you're lucky enough to go to a rich public school that is well funded and can offer a philosophy class as a English or a social studies elective, right? So that is good. Oh, the time is really going. I have an appointment at the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to wrap this up and get going. I'll take this last question from Massac. While translating your work, did your conception of the divine philosophy, theology change, or was it fixed and crystallized from the beginning? Neither, because my views are kind of a hybrid of a lot of different things, lots of moving parts. And so are many of the people involved in these debates as well. So, all right, I'm going to bring this to a close. It's been a nice hour to pass with all of you, and normally I'd stick around more, but I got an appointment with somebody to talk about death. So I will see all of you. We're going to do this again next week. I'll see you then.